Thank you very much, and I'm very glad to be here this evening. Thank you for inviting me. And without further ado, Canadian nurses, the first contingent. On October 14th, 1914, the great ships carrying over 30,000 volunteers of the Canadian First Contingent were sighted off Plymouth. There we go. As word spread that the Canadians had arrived, cheering crowds gathered to watch the ships anchor and the troops disembark. Among the sea of thousands of khaki-clad soldiers, though, a tiny group of 101 women stood out in their navy blue uniforms and hats. Led by Matron-in-Chief Margaret MacDonald, the first contingent of Canadian Army Medical Corps nurses had arrived in England. Over the next 4.5 years, these women would serve in every theater of war, from France to Gallipoli, from Salonika to Russia. They were the forerunners of the 2,800 Canadian military nurses who would battle far from their home country to save lives during the First World War. Canada had never set up a wartime hospital in the field, and it had sent only 12 nurses to the Second South African War. In all ways, then, these first women were pioneers who would make the reputation of Canada's nursing services and of their hospitals. The nurses came to war because, as Constance Bruce wrote in 1918, the excitement was thrilling, the lottery alluring, and the cause glorious. And her words were echoed by many others of the 100. And who were these nurses? The first 100 had been carefully chosen from thousands of applications sent in from across Canada. Their names were Ethel and Edith, Annie and Amy, Florence and Rena, and Maybelle and Margaret. Most were born in Canada, all were British subjects, and most were Protestants. Although they were supposed to be single, one admitted to being married. And although they were supposed to be between 21 and 44 years of age, a number claimed to be younger than they actually were, including the matron-in-chief, who said she was a youthful 35 when she was actually 41. 65 were between 25 and 34. The youngest was Jean Sword at 21, and the oldest was Addie Tupper, who said she was 44, but who was really 54. The women came from across Canada, carefully selected to represent every province from British Columbia in the west to PEI in the east. 6, including the matron-in-chief, were veterans of either the Second South African War, the Spanish-American War in the Philippines, or both. 1, Amy Scott, had made the arduous trek to the Yukon Gold Rush in 1898 to nurse in Dawson City before traveling to the other end of the world to serve in the South African War. Others were chosen because their families had influence with the War Office. PEI's Rena McLean, for instance, whose father was a Canadian senator, and Cecily Galt, whose father was a judge. Margaret Parks was an anomaly. Her services as a doctor were refused, but she was offered a place as a nurse. 2 of the nurses had earned their places through an almost forgotten episode involving the Canadian Navy on the Pacific coast. In August 1914, the Navy commissioned the Prince George as a hospital ship. On August 20th, when the ship was still being painted in harbor, a rumor circulated that an enemy ship had been spotted, and the Prince George went to sea so quickly that 20 of its crew were left on the docks. On board were nurses Penelope Mellon and Emma Black, along with 4 others, the first nurses in the Canadian Navy. Their trip, alas, was short, for the Prince George sailed to Alaska to refuel and was back in harbor by September 1st. The ship was then returned to its owners and the crew were paid off. However disappointing this sudden end to adventure may have been for the nurses, It almost certainly earned Emma and Penelope their places in the First Contingent. The most important qualification for Canadian nurses was to have graduated from a reputable 3-year training school for nurses. Matron-in-Chief MacDonald insisted that only graduate nurses worked on the wards of Canadian war hospitals. 2 or 3 women on the voyage who were not qualified were quietly given other roles, while 4 qualified women were added in England. And almost as soon as the first 100 nurses had disembarked from their ship, they were whisked through the English countryside by train to London, feasting on Devonshire cream sent by Nancy Astor. In London, the matron of St. Thomas Hospital proved hospitable and efficient in providing rooms for the newcomers. For the next 3 weeks, the Canadians were inundated with invitations to visit everything from hospitals to theaters. There was just one thing that troubled them slightly. The British public was unfamiliar with their uniforms, the dress uniform of navy blue and the ward uniform of light blue, worn with a white apron and veil, the latter earning the Canadians the nickname of bluebirds. Both uniforms had a double row of brass buttons, and both carried the stars of rank on the shoulders. The Canadians held the relative rank and pay of officers, nursing sisters that of lieutenant, matrons that of captain, and the matron-in-chief that of major. In London, the nurses were asked quite frequently if they were policewomen, and they were also queried about their rank. Many learned quite quickly to cover up their stars with a cardigan or cape. And they were impatient to get to work, to do what they had come to do. In early November, matron Myra Goodeve and 9 nurses went to Salisbury Plain to provide medical aid for the Canadian First Contingent, who were encamped there. Conditions were at first primitive at Bulford Manor. Though the nurses ate nothing but bully beef and hardtack for the first 3 weeks, the matron-in-chief commented not a word of complaint was heard. 50 nurses would serve there during the worst winter in years. The floods and the mud were legendary. Yet the nurses remained cheerful and boosted the morale of troops. Who wouldn't smile back at a nurse jauntily wading through the water and mud to the hospital? 37 other nurses were excited to travel to France to open number 2 stationary hospital in Le Touquet in November, with another 18 stationed at British hospitals nearby. Working under the first Canadian matron in France, Ethel Ridley, those posted to number 2 rapidly converted the Gulf Hotel into a hospital. Mabel Clint, a redoubtable older nurse from Montreal, recalled a hectic week of scrubbing everything in sight. Unpacking, bed making, setting up an operating theater, and arranging a schedule of duties. When the first 150 patients arrived on December 4th, Clint wrote that every member of the staff was on his or her mettle, for we felt Canadian efficiency might be judged by this sample of organization and training. Within 2 hours, the men were warm, clean, and dead to the world in deepest sleep. Such was the medical unit's enthusiasm that everyone remained up most of the night, according to Clint. These first convoys were light, mostly men with trench foot and minor wounds, and they enabled the medical corps to adjust their procedures. By the time the Battle of Neuve Chapelle was fought in March 1915, number 2 stationary was fighting fit, and it needed to be. Elfrida Atrill, in a letter home, took her readers into the wards where she was on night duty. A trainload of about 150 are being sent to us, of which 84 are bad stretcher cases, she wrote. It is close upon midnight when the 10 or 12 ambulances make their first journey, and the unloading and passing before the admitting officer begins. It is a ghostly procession to which we have become accustomed. Quietly, they file along the corridors, these broken men from the trenches, caked with clay, ragged, dirty, worn out and silent. They stumble into the warmth of the wards. A long line of stretchers fills the hallway, but it is the exception to hear a groan or complaint, though this is the convoy with the worst wounds we have yet received. Bodies are literally shattered, and the journey must have been a terrible one. At each station, we are told, some dead have been removed. Cases of gangrene have already developed, and in 36 hours are very far advanced. These are the cases especially allotted to me. Those at number 2 had been the first Canadians in France, and their patients so far had been British. But in February 1915, the Canadian Army entered the trenches, and on April 22nd, 1915, the Canadians and the French troops beside them suffered the first poison gas attack of the war. This was the beginning of the Second Battle, Ypres. The number of casualties meant that number 2 became a clearing station where soldiers arrived straight from the front. Wounded Canadians flooded the hospital. Within a week, over 1,100 casualties, some horrifically wounded, had passed through the hospital. Clint vividly describes how shock and relief alternated when the first Canadian convoy arrived, as the medical staff sought word of brothers and friends until all were silenced by the extent of the casualties and their wounds. Constance Bruce wrote that after a convoy, it was pitiable to see the rooms and passages literally strewn with wounded until one had to step over them in passing, their bandages and clothes stiff with blood and caked with mud. Vivian Tremaine, who had opened number 1 Canadian Casualty Clearing Station in February, experienced the same rush, with nurses Janet McDonald and Maybelle Sampson joining her there. The movements of Canadian troops to the trenches called for more Canadian hospitals and nurses in France. By March, the rest of the first 100 nurses were in France to open number 1 Stationary and numbers 1 and 2 General, reinforced by more nurses from Canada. Stationary hospitals, by the way, had up to 540 beds, while general hospitals held over 1,000. For all of the new hospitals, the Battle of Loos in September 1915 was their testing ground. Number 2 General had over 1,000 patients, all very seriously wounded within 3 days of the battle, the first serious casualties they had received. September 29th was an awful day, Matron Ethel Rayside wrote, because one of the ward tents blew down and the patients had to be transferred to an unfinished hut nearby. Another convoy of 306, all stretchers, arrived about noon. Several of the sisters' tents have also blown down. Rayside added, however, that everyone has done their very best and the patients have all been dressed and fed. All the day sisters worked far into the night. The next month, Canadian nurses had reason to be proud of one of their own in one of the most unusual incidents of the war. On October 28th, Vivian Tremaine, matron of number 1 CCS, was startled when Surgeon General McPherson suddenly arrived and told her quietly that the king had been badly injured in an accident and that she was to nurse him. Tremaine wrote later that my main thought was of the tremendous responsibility and that I should never get over it should I not be able to cope with whatever emergency might arise. According to what King George told her, he was inspecting Canadian troops nearby when his horse, excited by the noise and cheers of the men, reared, slipped on the muddy pavé, and fell, crushing the king beneath him. Tremaine added, the king was fearfully bruised over his entire body. She and a British colleague nursed King George at Buckingham Palace for 6 weeks while he recovered from a very long, tedious, and painful illness. What Tremaine remembers most is the king's unselfishness and generosity in spite of his pain. On December 23rd, King George, Queen Mary, Princess Mary, and Prince Albert gathered to say goodbye. King George made a wonderfully kind speech of thanks to the nurses and presented each with the Royal Victorian Order Silver Medal, given only for special service to His Majesty, a beautiful brooch, and a signed photograph. No one, wrote Tremaine, could be with the royal family for so long without being impressed by the simple, happy, affectionate atmosphere of their life. Tellingly, King George followed Tremaine's career. 2 years later, when he invested a colleague from Tremaine's hospital with the Royal Red Cross, he exclaimed, "Why, that is Sister Tremaine's hospital," and mentioned that he believed she was visiting family in Canada at that moment. And in fact, he was right. By the spring of 1916, 3 casualty clearing stations with matrons and nurses from the First Contingent, 2 stationary hospitals, and 5 general hospitals were working in France. Usually, a small nucleus of First Contingent nurses was assigned to each new hospital. In June 1916, all Canadian hospitals were warned to clear the wards and evacuate as many patients as possible. Ironically, July 1st, the opening day of the Battle of the Somme, coincided with Canada's Dominion Day, the anniversary of the forming of the nation. Unaware of the fighting on the Somme front, Canadians at most of the hospitals in France celebrated with sports days and concerts. The CO of No. 2 Casualty Clearing Station juxtaposed a description of the sports and the evening concert with this telling comment: "The ground fairly rocked and windows rattled with the concussion of the terrific bombardment which has occurred today at the front." At No. 1 General, patients began to arrive that same evening with hundreds in convoys over the next few days. 412 on July 2nd, 582 on July 3rd, 310 on the 4th. Each day, too, hundreds of patients were evacuated while the operating room worked nonstop. This hospital admitted more than 3 times its usual number of patients during July, and every available space was used for beds. At No. 2 General, the first convoy of 253 came in at 10:30 a.m. on July 2nd, mostly stretcher cases and all very badly wounded. According to the acting matron, another bad convoy came in at 6:30, mostly surgical and a great many serious cases. Sisters busy in op room till 3 a.m., with another 64 operations scheduled for the next day. By July 4th, many patients were arriving with only their first field dressing on, and the surgeons had performed 130 operations in 24 hours. The same story could be told of all the hospitals in France. By the fall of 1916, the First Contingent nurses had been working steadily for almost 2 years, and the work had taken its toll on some. 13 nurses had been resigned or been sent home as permanently unfit, including Amy Scott, veteran of the Yukon and Second South African War. Addie Tupper of Nova Scotia, the oldest nurse of the First Contingent, now 56, had served at No. 2 General in France and had been awarded the Royal Red Cross. In early December, Tupper visited Buckingham Palace for her investiture. Only a few days later, she was admitted to hospital with pneumonia. Nursing sister Addie Tupper, RRC, died on December 9th, 1916, and is buried in the hospital at Uxbridge. A number of other First Contingent nurses were having a wholly different war. In mid-1915, British medical authorities approached Canadian medical authorities. Could they and would they send Canadian hospitals to the Dardanelles, where the soldiers from Gallipoli were dying for lack of medical treatment? As we now know, the situation there was desperate, and so the Canadians agreed to send 3 stationary hospitals with 26 nurses each. Number 1 with First Contingent matron Eleanor Charlson, and number 3 would be stationed on the Greek island of Lemnos, 60 miles from the peninsula and 600 from Alexandria. While number 5 would open at Cairo with First Contingent matron Bertha Willoughby. Number 3 was new to active service, but number 1 had been operating in France since 1915, and most of its nurses were from the First Contingent. They were accustomed to pioneering. Nevertheless, the conditions on Lemnos were a shock. Constance Bruce wrote in her memoir, "Can anyone who set foot on the Greek island of Lemnos on that summer day ever forget the stones, the dust, and the flies?" Mabel Clint wrote about her first glimpse of soldier patients on the ship tied alongside theirs. The men were actually starving, unkempt, gaunt, and ragged. Dozens lay on straw on deck. Some had no boots. They appeared to have no affinity with the healthy first-line fighting men in France. When their hospital opened on August 26, 1915, most of the patients had dysentery. The nurses described them as poor souls and pathetic sights, critically ill with fevers that left them worn to skeletons, physical wrecks, and terribly famished and exhausted. Worse still, few arrangements had been made for supplies of food or water. The food was scanty and water severely rationed. Bruce wrote of those days, "One hesitated to gather courage before passing down the long rows of tightly packed beds, where sunken eyes were focused on everyone who went by, or parched tongues held out in silent entreaty. Yet for hours on end, there was not a drop of water to be had." More than one nurse wrote home that it was heartbreaking. The nurses, too, were hungry and thirsty, working long hours while temperatures soared over 40 degrees Celsius. First reinforcement, Helen Folds was later to recall, "We were so hungry, we could have eaten nails." Worse, the patient's dysentery spread to the medical staff. The COs of both units fell ill. In early September, Nursing Sister Monroe of number 3 died, followed on September 25th by her matron, Jessie Jaggard. In those early dark days, First Contingent nurse Myra Goodeve, who had been at Bulford Manor, stood out by raising morale, especially for the younger nurses. At this time, almost all were sick and hungry, the food was almost uneatable, and bickering was rampant. As colleague Helen Folds wrote, "She saved our lives at first out here. Myra thanked God in the most approved way for each new culinary atrocity, while we all laughed till we wept. She sat up and ate the rotten messes as if she'd been dining at the Ritz with all the airs and graces. And we all did our best to follow suit. Every bite she estimated at its caloric value, and by Jove, she was the saving of us, for we'd all have had to cut out meals entirely if we hadn't had the conversation to look forward to. We discussed all sorts of learned subjects and art and music, and Myra's comments on everything were sure to be worth getting to meals for." Conditions got somewhat better in October. In November, when a fierce blizzard suddenly swept the peninsula, the nurses, freezing themselves, tended to hundreds of patients with frozen feet. But their ordeal was almost over. When the peninsula was evacuated, the nurses rejoiced in meeting some of the first soldiers to come back, and they improvised a cheerful Christmas for their remaining patients, pooling their money to buy vegetables, treats, and gifts for them. On February 1st, both hospitals sailed for Alexandria. Number 3 recuperated there, then went directly back to France. Number 1, after a rest in Cairo, was sent to Salonika. In 1916, numbers 4 and 5 General would join number 1 stationary in Salonika to serve the soldiers of the Macedonian front. In total, 28 First Contingent nurses would serve in the Mediterranean, more than a quarter of the originals. The cost of serving there is evident from the nurses' records. Throughout 1916, a steady stream of nurses were invalided back to England with dysentery, with malaria, with anemia, with debility. Rena McLean was one of them, and Mabel Clint was left dangerously ill in Cairo. Some took months to recover from their ordeal, and few returned to France. Instead, they remained in England, working at Canadian hospitals and convalescent homes. Yet, in 1917, experienced nurses were never more needed than on the Western Front. First Contingent nurse Lucy Squire, though, was far, far away, working at the Anglo-Russian hospital in Petrograd. The hospital, a gift of the British to their ally Russia, was situated in the Dmitry Palace on the Nevsky Prospect, just down the street from the Winter Palace. In March 1917, by the Western calendar, 4 Canadian nurses, including Squire, watched the Russian Revolution unfold from their hospital windows. On March 7th, the unrest began, and by the 9th, as Squire's colleague Edith Hegan wrote, "From our second-story window, we see riots continually in progress and wounded and dying falling everywhere as the police charge the streets. Many of the Tsar's troops are deserting him and coming over to the revolutionists." The nurses were not safe. Not only were bullets shot through the windows of the hospital, but they had to struggle through the crowds to the residence for meals. On March 12th, as they were collecting their belongings there, bullets flew through the house and hummed through the window directly between our heads. Daily now, the hospital was searched, and one night, an officer and armed guard demanded 25 suits of clothes. The nurses had to improvise Red Cross flags to protect the hospital by using sheets and an old Santa Claus suit. On the 13th, "The streets are filling with a howling mob," Egan wrote, "and the scenes are indescribable." But by the 16th, the streets had quieted sufficiently for the nurses to be allowed to go out, and Hegan was writing that the Tsar and the Tsarina are imprisoned in their own fortress. It is such a stupendous change that the mind can hardly grasp it. But we go ahead and do our work. It had taken a little over a week to change the face of Russia. Squire and Hegan were ordered back to England almost immediately. Their 2 colleagues who stayed witnessed the changes the revolution wrought. Squire and Hegan had barely had time to reach England before Canadian eyes were riveted on the Battle of Vimy Ridge in April 1917. At this battle, the 4 Canadian divisions fought together for the first time and won a victory that is still today heralded as unifying the nation. Myra Goodeve, that tower of strength in Lemnos, had joined number 2 General just in time for this important battle. 2 months later, she would become its matron. At the casualty clearing stations, doctor nursing sister Margaret Parks continued to give anesthetics, as she would do throughout the war. 10,000 Canadians became casualties during this one battle. For the nurses, it again meant convoy upon convoy and the deaths of brothers, friends, and family. In July 1917, First Contingent nurse Harriet Graham was just preparing to lead number 2 clearing station, having been its matron since February 1916. Number 2 was now paired with number 3 casualty clearing station, both at Remy Siding near Paparinge, so that one could take in while the other evacuated. Remy Siding was a hot spot, as one of the nurses wrote home, because of shelling and air raids. If Graham expected a quiet last month, she was sadly mistaken. On July 31st at 3:50 a.m., the Allies attacked on the Ypres sector across an 18-kilometer front. According to the CCS's war diary, from July 1st to 30th, the CCS took in 3,500 casualties. During the 5 days from July 25th to August 4th, it admitted almost 5,000. On August 1st alone, more than 2,000 patients swamped the CCS, with convoys arriving by train at its front door, while others arrived by car at the back. Patients spilled out over the grass in the rain. Over 11,000 casualties arrived during August 1917, with 9,000 evacuations and almost 2,000 operations performed. Across the road at number 3, the nurses were working just as hard. Throughout September, October, and November, convoys continued to arrive, though not in such numbers. The battlefields of Passchendaele, churned up by the heavy bombardment, were seas of mud, and the Canadians sheltered in holes rather than in trenches. As always, the winter provided a welcome respite, though cases of pneumonia and illness continued to keep the nurses busy. In the spring of 1918, Mabel Quince, whom we last saw in Cairo with pulmonary thrombosis, had battled her way back to number 3 Canadian General in France, stationed at Boulogne, even though her medical board months previously had stated that she would never be fully fit. She arrived just in time for the German advance, which began on March 21st, 1918. Before the German attack even began on the 21st, the clearing stations were being shelled. Acting matron Janet MacDonald, who had opened number 1 clearing station with Vivian Tremaine in 1915, and her colleague, Dr. Margaret Parks, were working at Pernes. Jean Johnson and Mary Domville were at number 2 at Remy Siding, with First Contingent colleagues Emma Pence and Ida Smith just across the road at number 3. On March 18th, the shelling became so intense that the nurses of both clearing stations were evacuated. Number 2 returned to Remy Siding on the 29th, but number 3 moved to Frévent to reopen. By now, each clearing station had surgical teams consisting of a surgeon, a nursing sister, an anesthetist, possibly a sister, and an orderly. They traveled with a complete set of instruments and equipment, including a folding surgical table. So they were highly mobile. 2 such teams, including First Contingent Jean Johnson, left number 2 to move closer to the front on March 21st. First Reinforcement Claire Gass with number 2 wrote on April 5th that the German advance was an appalling disaster. Albert has fallen and the Huns are threatening Arras. Captain Beggs and Miss Johnson and their teams have gone back with a retreat. It turned out that Johnson and her team had marched 30 kilometers camping on the roadsides with the retreat, and that she had helped her team to set up a dressing station somewhere in a hen house. By the 11th, the OR at number 2 was working night and day, with hundreds of patients arriving and shelling still going on. On April 14th, with the German army a mere 5 kilometers away, the nurses of number 2 were given half an hour to leave. By April 26, it had reopened in Escobec, and the nurses were working with not a spare moment except the hurried lunch at noon. Not until May were the nurses able to take regular days off again and to enjoy the spring. The nights were becoming tense. Mabel Clint, who was reveling at being back in the action, noted that air raids came almost nightly in the spring and summer of 1918. Many hospitals clustered near the railway line in Étape, including No. 1 General. May 18th was a brilliantly sunny day there, and No. 1's matron, First Contingent nurse Edith Campbell, took a moment to appreciate the new dining room for up patients, which had been opened that very day, and to write about it in her diary. The spring had been a busy time, especially, of course, March and April, and the hospital had received the evacuated staff and patients of several other hospitals, as well as hundreds of patients. Every available space, including the Red Cross hut and the canteen, had held patients on stretchers. On April 16th, over 2,200 patients were being treated by 142 nurses, with another 10 nurses on surgical teams closer to the front. By May 18th, though, the rush had calmed somewhat. Campbell especially admired the green of the plants that the medical staff had planted to cover the sandy soil. Her almost lyrical description is in stark contrast to her description of the night. 10:30, the first bomb fell, she wrote. My first thought was for the sisters in the huts in our quadrangle. I brought them into the main hut where they took what shelter they could under beds and flat on the floor. The second bomb, followed by incendiary and machine guns, set the men's lines on fire and the non-com officers, most of whom were asleep. The planes circled round this target, doing great damage to the lines, to the officers' quarter and the sisters' quarters. The femur wards were untouched except for broken glass. The patients behaving calmly, the sisters reported. Our own men suffered horribly, burned and machine gunned. 59 non-com officers and men killed or mortally wounded and died in hospital. Total casualties were 106. In the sisters' quarters, one end where the night sister slept was hit and gutted. Machine gun bullets found indoors afterward, and shrapnel penetrated through many of the rooms. Sister Catherine MacDonald was killed instantly. Sister Lowe and Sister Wake mortally wounded, and Sisters Wishart, Gallagher, Hirsch, McKinnon, and Long wounded. Nursing sisters on duty carried on through those ghastly 2 hours of bombing, cool and devoted to duty. Some of the huts had been badly damaged, 6 patients killed and 34 wounded, and the sisters had to go from hut to hut attending their patients. The operating room was soon in action. The nursing sisters got everything ready, windows and entrance covered with thick gray blankets, and the OC and his team were operating when the planes returned. Campbell does not say that she herself helped to rescue patients and ensure her wounded nurses got medical care. On May 31st, the Germans struck again. For 2 hours, the bombs fell, destroying Matron Campbell's office, damaging the femur wards, and hitting the kitchen and other offices. Campbell, who traversed the grounds repeatedly to check on her nurses, said this raid was much harder to bear than the others. Fortunately, the huts and tents were now sandbagged, and the off-duty nurses were sent to trenches during the raid. Campbell continued to make her rounds, and while she was calming the patients in one tent, a Welshman in the next tent began to sing. His voice was beautiful and clear without a quaver, and gradually as he sang, other voices joined until most of them were singing, even as the bombs and shrapnel were falling. It steadied our nerves like nothing else could, Campbell commented. When this night ended, a number of hospitals in the Etap area had been hit. Number one's nurses were sent to the woods to sleep, and the patients were evacuated until number one itself closed down later that month. 5 of Campbell's nursing sisters received the military medal for their courage and their gallant conduct during those 2 raids, including matron Edith Campbell herself. Disaster seemed to hit on all sides in those uncertain days as the German army desperately tried to advance. Mabel Clint was still working hard at number 3, and others of the First Contingent were also in other hospitals and casualty clearing stations. Many, though, were back in England or on transport duty to Canada. This last was considered a reward for hard work and a chance to see family in Canada. Many of the nurses had not been back since they had sailed in October 1914. When placed on transport duty, they were often given 3 weeks leave, enough time to go home and visit. In June 1918, 5 First Contingent nurses were working on the Landovery Castle among the 14 nurses aboard. Matron Margaret Fraser, Alexina Dussault, Minnie Follette, Maybelle Sampson, and Rena McLean. All 5 had nursed in France since the beginning. All 5 had nursed in casualty clearing stations. Maybelle Sampson had been mentioned in dispatches, while Rena McLean had been awarded the Royal Red Cross. On June 27, 1918, a German U-boat torpedoed the hospital ship, then machine gunners shelled those who had survived the sinking. All 14 nursing sisters on board died. In the words of one of the few survivors, the 14 sisters, unflinchingly and calmly, as steady and collected as if on parade, faced the ordeal of certain death as our lifeboat neared the mad whirlpool of waters where all human power was helpless. But despite grief and loss, the tide was turning in the war zone that summer. Though air raids and convoys and casualties continued, the Allied victories brought relief and hope that the end was in sight. Lucy Squire, who had watched the Russian Revolution, took over as acting matron at Casualty Clearing Station number 2 in August. And as the German army retreated during the fall, Mabel Clint attained her heart's desire. She joined number 4 clearing station in Mons just as the armistice was declared, and so had the opportunity to nurse the final casualties from the fighting. She also found herself, as did all Canadian nurses, dealing with the influenza patients who flooded the clearing stations and hospitals. Stretchers occupied every vacant space, she wrote. To add to the distress, dying men were brought in who had been turned loose by the enemy from their prison camps. Most of the nurses were too busy on November 11th to celebrate the armistice fully, though most gave a sigh of relief and kept on working. It was difficult to realize that the guns had finally fallen silent and that the war had been won. Where were the first 100 Canadian nursing sisters in 1918 and 19? 1 had died of illness and 5 due to enemy action. 30 had resigned by the armistice, at least 6 of those to be married, and 10 due to debility or other illness. 22 were in hospital on November 11th, 30 were working in England, and 5 were running hospitals in Canada. A total of 56 First Contingent nurses were healthy and demobbed in 1919, and an additional 7 were invalided home that same year. 58 of the 100 had been decorated. Among them, they were awarded 1 CDE, 1 OBE, 13 Royal Red Crosses, first class, 4 of those with bar, 44 Royal Red Crosses second class, 1 military medal, 1 Médaille des Épines en argent awarded by the French government, and 1 Royal Victorian Medal. 55 had earned the 1914 star. The influence of the first 100 was far greater than their numbers. They had opened the first Canadian war hospitals in France and England, and the matrons of most of those were from the First Contingent. These pioneering women and their work had shaped Canadian war nursing services for the rest of the war. In the post-war years, the first 100 would be the only Canadian women to remember the tumultuous cheers as the Canadian Armada arrived at Plymouth in 1914. They were the first Canadian nurses to hear the guns of France and to cope with the horrific wounds and gassed soldiers. And over 4.5 long years, they had cared for soldiers in every theater of the First World War. In the post-war years, they would not forget their comrades. First Contingent nurses were instrumental in starting local chapters of the Overseas Nursing Association, a female veterans organization that sprang up spontaneously in 1920. And these women raised funds for a memorial to their fallen comrades, which was unveiled in Ottawa in 1926. First Contingent nurse Juliette Pelletier, now Mrs. Gordon Ramsay, became its first national president in 1929. Constance Bruce, who married a doctor after the war and spent time in India, wrote Humor and Tragedy in 1918, and Mabel Clint would return to private nursing and write her memoir, Our Bit, in 1934. Recalcitrant as ever, she would refuse to have it edited. Both of these accounts are now, unfortunately, out of print. Many of the other nurses quietly returned to their homes, put away their uniforms, and carried on with earning a living. Alfreda Atro went back to Manitoba, and Ethel Ridley returned to the New York Orthopedic Hospital. Lawrence Hunter, Emma Black, and others would marry, yet remain active in volunteer organizations such as St. John's Ambulance and the Overseas Nursing Association. Little is known about those who returned to Canada considered permanently unfit and unable to continue nursing. Today, few remember the service of these 100 pioneering women, and even fewer know their names. And so I thank you this evening for listening and for celebrating the First Canadian Contingent of First World War nurses and for helping to perpetuate their memories. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions that they would like to ask? Please feel free either to ask it. Sarah there. Hi, Sarah. You're on mute at the moment. You just need to unmute.
Sorry about that. Thank you for a fabulous, absolutely amazing talk. I'm very into the nurses, and that's my pet thing. I'm interested in all this first contingent. I take it that they were all, you said they were mainly Protestant. When did the first Indigenous nurses become involved? Because I know you've got people like Edith Montour and Marion Smith and people like that who are nurses as well. When are they allowed, in inverted commas, to serve, please?
Not for some years yet. In fact, Canadian nursing training hospitals before the First World War refused to admit anyone who was Black or Indigenous. And so Edith Anderson Montour, for example, was one of the first 2 Indigenous women to serve with the American forces in the First World War, which I think is just such a shame. I mean, it is a shame on the nursing profession that she was neither allowed to enter a nurse training school nor allowed to work with the forces. I believe it was the 1930s and more towards the West that nurses were allowed to enter the training schools out there who were not white. Up until that time, it really had been very, very constrained, and we are not proud of that. Thank you for your excellent question.
No, you can move forward and learn. So thank you very much for that. That's all.
Yes.
Can I jump on that on the end of that question and ask about French Canadians as well? Like, because I noticed that you said that most of them are Protestants, but I was just curious about French Canadians, and also if there were any French Canadians in that first 100. I am a French Canadian. Wondering about whether what the relationship was like with the other nurses between French Canadians and Anglo Canadians.
Yes, thank you for that question. So yes, there were French Canadian, French speaking nurses from Quebec. I'm not sure about other parts of Canada with the First Canadian Contingent. Juliette Pelletier was one of them. She was from an influential French speaking political family. She was fluently bilingual. There were several more. They tended to be Catholic. Julia Pelletier and some of the other nurses had what I would call a really good war as far as comradeship and companionship went. She apparently got along quite well with her colleagues. I'm not sure about the nurses who didn't leave records. I believe Catherine de Bellefoy was in Salonika, also got along quite well with her comrades. There were 2 French-speaking hospitals set up by Canadians, numbers 4 and 6 General, or not number 4, number 6 and 8 General. They were stationed near Paris. And at first, they tried to staff those hospitals with all French-speaking nurses, but they could not do it. The experiences at that hospital don't seem to be as comradely, I would say, as at the other hospitals. Some of the English-speaking nurses who went there did not speak French at all at first, so they had a harder time. Blanche Lavallee left. She didn't leave records of her own. She left her mother's letters to her, so it's more difficult to get the records.
Any questions from anybody else? Oh, there's another question just from Sarah. Here that says, is there a bibliography that covers all Canadian nurses, please?
All Canadian nurses. You know, if you email me.
But where do you suggest I start?
So there are 3 books. One is in French, and the other 2 are in English that you might begin with. And goodness gracious me, Melanie Morin Pelletier. I may have the name wrong. Anyway, start with Cynthia Toman, Toman, Sister Soldiers, easy title to remember. That's one of the first histories of the Canadian nursing sisters in the First World War. And that's always a good place to start. She will give you almost all the references to publicly available sources. I hesitate to mention my own book, but it's 2 Canadian nursing sisters letters, and you will also find lots of references. It's called War Torn Exchanges. And if you'd like to email me, I can give you more of a list.
Jane Backhouse has just asked, could you put the last slide up again?
Sure. So what I put up here are mostly the image sources, plus some of the diaries and letters, the archives of the diaries and letters that I found.
Hopefully you've got what you needed. Lovely. a couple of people saying that Jane Backhouse said, wonderful talk, wonderful women. Thank you. Rose Sheaf or Chefe, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, said bravo, fascinating, horrifying and deeply moving. Thank you. So
Thank you.
Lovely. That's all of the questions that we have this evening. So
Thank you so very much. And thank you everyone for coming. It was a pleasure.
thank you.
Mademoiselle.